Welcome to the ancient world. I want you to imagine a world without writing. No books, no letters, not even the social media posts we read every day. Or a world without laws or government, where everyone does as they please without following any common rules. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But that's exactly the world that once existed. And then, a magical moment happened. Someone, somewhere on Earth, had an unprecedented idea. They created something entirely new, a breakthrough that changed everything forever. It could have been a simple drawing, a symbol, or a basic tool, but it sparked a great wave of civilization. That is the story I'm going to tell you. My obsession isn't with battles or kings, but with those moments of breakthrough. Humanity's firsts. While I'm not a professional historian, I believe the stories of these pioneers and the great ideas that shaped our world deserve to be told. The goal of this podcast is simple. We will travel together from 3500 BC to 500 BC, exploring ancient civilizations across the globe, from Egypt to China, from Mesopotamia all the way to South America. We'll uncover the first achievements in everything from religion and politics to trade, science, and warfare. This is meant to be a broad overview, a door for you to open and explore in more depth later on. Let's begin our journey back in time and discover how we became us. All right, so let's dive right in, starting with agriculture and irrigation. I know, agriculture might sound a bit dull. We're all eager to get to the exciting stuff, like armies, empires, conquests, and betrayals. And believe me, we'll get there. But first, we absolutely need to begin with agriculture. The initial steps towards civilization were taken around 10,000 BC, when modern humans in various parts of the ancient world began to domesticate plants and animals and establish settled villages, typically near sources of fresh water like rivers or lakes. The next significant milestone arrived around 5000 BC with the development of irrigation. As far as we know, the earliest instances of irrigation took place in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers in modern-day Iraq, in Elam, which is located in present-day Iran, and on the island of Crete. Other regions where irrigation evolved independently at a somewhat later time include Egypt, the Norte Chico region in modern-day Peru, Mesoamerica, essentially central and southern Mexico, and along the Yellow River in China. The Near East and Crete had a head start on the rest of the ancient world when it came to irrigation due to a couple of key factors. First, these regions had exceptionally fertile floodplains. Second, the Near East was home to a significant number of plants and animals suitable for domestication. In other words, selective breeding to make them more beneficial to humans, particularly cereal crops and other staples that could be stored for long periods of time. Additionally, cultivating olives and vines on hillsides that were unsuitable for growing cereals also boosted agricultural productivity. So, why was irrigation such a critical development? The answer is simple. Irrigation led to agricultural surpluses, meaning people were growing more food than they needed for basic survival. These surpluses had to be stored somewhere, which in turn led to the construction of the first public buildings. Both irrigation and the construction of public buildings required an organized workforce. And a workforce implies that you need an efficient system to collect food and then redistribute it as rations. So, what kind of authority figure would emerge to manage such an undertaking? To see one possible answer to that question, let's introduce one of the most influential players on the stage of early human history, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were a diverse group comprised of farmers, hunter-fishermen, and nomadic pastoralists, all of whom were considered Sumerian because they shared a common language. The early power brokers in Sumerian society were the priests, who presented themselves as intermediaries between the people and the gods. The people either thanked these gods for their bounty or feared them as the cause of devastating floods and other calamities. The Sumerians had a vast pantheon of gods, which eventually numbered in the thousands. But the most prominent at the time were An, Ki, and Enlil, their offspring. Due to their unique position in Sumerian society, priests had the ability to motivate the population to construct and maintain public works by asserting that such efforts were mandated, or at least viewed favorably, by the gods. Surplus grain was stored in temples, where priests controlled its collection, distribution, and trade, all in the service of the gods, of course. During years of poor harvests, priests loaned out grain in exchange for commodities, services, or repayment with substantial interest. Besides the wealth and power associated with their central role in grain distribution, priests also owned land and supervised large temple staffs, including cooks, weavers, and musicians. Early evidence of the career specialization made possible by agricultural surpluses. This structure of intensive, year-round agriculture supporting a priestly ruling class is believed to have originated at the Sumerian city of Eridu, around 5000 BC. Eridu is widely regarded as the world's oldest continuously inhabited city, and was considered by the Sumerians to be one of only 5 cities built on Earth before the Great Flood, which was a parallel in Sumerian mythology to the biblical flood. The development of agriculture accelerated and spread with the invention of the plow around 4500 BC. It soon became widespread across the entire Sumerian region and beyond. Over the ensuing centuries, Sumerian temples grew in size and cities sprung up around the temples, with the priests continuing to exert a strong influence over the growing population. Sumerian religion also evolved and adapted in response to increasing urbanization, and Sumerian gods began to be associated with specific cities. For instance, Enki, the god of freshwater, male fertility, and knowledge, a pretty good combination, by the way, became the patron god of Eridu. Around 3100 BC came the Sumerian invention of writing, which initially began when priests started using pictographs of common objects, such as sheaves of grain, to record food transactions. Over time, these pictographs evolved into abstract, wedge-shaped characters called cuneiform, which were inscribed in clay with a pointed stick called a stylus. Along with agriculture, the invention of writing, the concept of visually representing sounds, objects, or ideas, is considered another pivotal milestone along the path of human development. It's believed that writing was only invented independently by a handful of cultures across the world: Sumer, Minoan Crete, Shang Dynasty China, Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization, and the Olmec. From those locations, writing spread, changed, and developed over thousands of years into all the written languages that now exist worldwide. To take just one example, the English alphabet descends from the Latins, who adapted it from the Greeks, who adapted it from the Phoenicians through the addition of vowels, who adapted their writing system from a Proto-Canaanite script, who adapted some of their phonetic elements from Egyptian hieroglyphics. See? It's all that simple. Priests weren't the only important players in the crystallizing Sumerian power structure. Leaders of wealthy families formed councils of elders, which, in times of crisis, appointed a chief called a Lugal, big man, or Ensi, great man. By 3000 BC, Sumerian cities were rapidly expanding into city-states by taking control of surrounding villages, which ensured a consistent flow of food from the countryside. This expansion eventually led to competition among neighboring city-states for land and water, which led to warfare. Big men who led city-states into battle against their rivals and won significant victories, remained in power, and effectively became kings. These kings then further enhanced their prestige by building palaces near the temples, thereby associating themselves with the grain supply, the priests, and the city gods. Trade also became crucial to the growth of the early Sumerian city-states and helped spread Sumerian culture throughout the surrounding region. Since the Sumerians lacked local resources other than their fertile soil, commodities such as stone, timber, and metals had to be imported through developing trade networks. These trade networks were often managed by centralized bodies that grew wealthy from their control over import and distribution. Among the most prized metals at the time were tin and copper, which around 3000 BC were first combined by the Sumerians to create tin bronze. This development marked the beginning of the Bronze Age, the term that defines the next 2,000 years of human civilization. As in Egypt, which we'll be discussing shortly, Sumerian rulers were often buried with vast treasures, and their attendants were put to death during the burial to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. The wealth and power of Sumerian rulers stood in stark contrast to the multitude of slaves who occupied the bottom rungs of Sumerian society, primarily foreigners captured in battle or from slave raids into the neighboring hills. Between these two extremes, many specialized occupations emerged to fulfill the needs of kings, priests, and the masses living within the city walls. Among the new job titles were scribes, merchants, woodworkers, coppersmiths, and bakers. And, oh yes, there were also brewers, who fermented mashed barley into ale, the Sumerians' favorite beverage. In addition to the invention of ale, which should be enough to secure any civilization a place in the history books, the Sumerians were also the first to develop written laws. These laws were often designed to reinforce the ruler's authority and demonstrate his commitment to good governance to the city gods. But the laws also provided people with at least some assurance that their rights and property wouldn't be taken away from them arbitrarily. And if ale and laws weren't enough, the Sumerians were also the first people to make extensive use of wheeled vehicles. Okay, have I made the point that the Sumerians were innovative? Then I'll move on. Among the strongest of the early Sumerian city-states were Ur and Uruk. Ur was located close to the Persian Gulf and prospered from maritime trade with other early civilizations to the east. It was protected by a massive city wall made of mud brick and had a population of over 30,000, a huge number in ancient times. Ur is also known as the traditional birthplace of the biblical Abraham. Uruk, located to the north along the Euphrates, was even larger, with a population of over 50,000. Incidentally, this made it the largest city anywhere in the ancient world at that time. The walls of Uruk were supposedly built by the hero king Gilgamesh, who ruled the city around 2700 BC, a time of increasing violence between rival city-states. While Gilgamesh was likely a historical figure, he's best known as the protagonist of the legendary Epic of Gilgamesh, which originated as a series of Sumerian legends and poems before being fashioned into a longer Akkadian epic much later. At some point, the story was inscribed on baked clay tablets that lay hidden for over 2,000 years until they were rediscovered at Nineveh in modern-day Iraq in 1853. The Epic of Gilgamesh is rightfully considered the world's first story, being at least 1,000 years older than either the Iliad or the Bible. Besides being a literary masterpiece, which it is, it also provides us with valuable insights into the beliefs and practices of ancient Sumerian culture, particularly their views on death and the afterlife. I would encourage everyone to read it, especially Stephen Mitchell's modern translation. It is a truly remarkable work. Let's leave the Sumerians to enjoy their golden age for a bit, and turn our attention to another ancient civilization that was taking root around the same time: the Elamites. The early Elamite city of Susa was founded around 4000 BC in the southwest of modern-day Iran, just east of Mesopotamia. The influence of Elamite culture on the Persian plateau became significant around 3200 BC, and texts in the still undeciphered Proto-Elamite writing system date from this time until around 2700 BC. Unfortunately, we don't know a great deal about early Elamite civilization. What we do know mainly comes from contemporary Mesopotamian sources. At least 3 Elamite city-states, Awan, Anshan, and Simashki, merged to form Elam. The city of Susa was periodically annexed to this core group and then separated again. The combined state of Elam was formed around 2700 BC primarily as a strength in numbers response to frequent Sumerian incursions. Stone, timber, and metals were plentiful on the Persian plateau, which was at least one reason why nearby civilizations had begun to take more of an interest in the region. Strong Elamite kings were able to hold the component city-states together under a kind of federal system that facilitated internal trade while fostering military cooperation against external threats like the Sumerians. The Elamites would continue to be major players in the ancient Near East for some time, so we'll get to know them much better as we go along. Moving across Asia Minor, south along the Levant, and into North Africa, we come to the beginnings of one of the most powerful and influential civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt. At this time, Egypt was primarily a land of villages, with the Nile River serving as a communication conduit between them. The prevailing winds in Egypt blow from north to south, allowing ships to travel upstream using sails and then return downstream with the river's current. In addition to its usefulness as a highway, the Nile was also vitally important as the only source of fresh water in a land that saw virtually no rainfall. The yearly flooding of the Nile every July through October, the season of inundation fed by torrential rains in Ethiopia, was regularly followed by a season of drought used for harvesting. The early Egyptians learned to manage this cycle and, soon after the Mesopotamians, began to implement intensive agricultural irrigation along the narrow, fertile strip adjacent to the Nile. Beyond that strip to the east and west were deserts, which effectively isolated Egypt to such an extent that Egyptian civilization would be nearly 2,500 years old before it experienced its first major foreign invasion. As in other ancient societies, the need for a strong hand to direct large-scale irrigation projects led to the emergence of leadership figures, in this case, kings. With the founding of its first dynasty, or ruling family, around 3150 BC, Egyptian civilization officially enters the historical record. The concept of dividing Egyptian history by ruling dynasties comes from Manetho. Manetho was a Greco-Egyptian priest who lived in Heliopolis in Egypt around 300 BC. He was also an advisor to King Ptolemy I, the former general of Alexander the Great, whose family ruled Egypt from 323 BC until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. But now we're really getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, as a priest and advisor to the king, Manetho had access to the best available historical records of the time, including both scrolls and inscriptions on temple walls, and he used them to write his Egyptian history. In it, he divided Egyptian history into 30 ruling dynasties from the unification of Egypt around 3150 BC down to the death of the last native Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo II in 3B43 BC. A good rule of thumb to remember for Egypt is the number 3. 30 native ruling dynasties between around 3000 and 300 BC, or 30 BC if you want to include Cleopatra. Manetho's dynastic history has been corroborated by Egyptian king lists and other sources and presents a fairly accurate timeline of periods of rule, with a few notable exceptions. This is in contrast to Sumerian king lists, which don't provide realistic periods of rule prior to around 2200 BC. Before that, Many Sumerian kings were described as ruling for centuries, making them more legendary than historical. According to Manetho, Egyptian civilization began with the unification of the two lands, namely Upper and Lower Egypt, under one king. The first king of this ruling dynasty was named Scorpion, and the scant evidence suggests that he may have only been king of Upper Egypt, the term given to the southern portion along the Nile. His depiction on the scorpion mace head, which gives us the king's name, shows him wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt and performing a ceremony that may represent the seasonal flooding of the fields, or possibly the founding of a temple or city. The depiction of small birds hanging by their necks was intended to suggest that those who opposed him didn't fare very well. The villages of Upper Egypt that he conquered were all located within a narrow portion of the Nile floodplain, hemmed in by cliffs and desert. It's not surprising that this was the first area of Egypt to be united under a single ruler. It was up to the next king of this dynasty, named Narmer, to complete the unification of Egypt, supposedly by marching his forces north to the Nile Delta and conquering Lower Egypt. It should be noted that some scholars believe that Narmer may not have single-handedly unified Egypt through military conquest, but that he was instead merely a symbolic figure associated with the final stages of a unification that had been happening organically for some time. Regardless of the precise cause, the evidence we have for Egyptian unification is contained in the historically invaluable and artistically stunning Narmer palette. The palette, which probably served as a cosmetic aid for preparing eye paint, depicts Narmer on one side wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt while threatening an Asiatic captive, whom he grabs by the hair with an upraised mace. This is the earliest known occurrence of what was to become an icon of majesty throughout the rest of Egyptian history, right down to Roman times. This image also tells us a few other things. First, even at this very early stage, Egypt was clearly already engaging with the Near East, even if that engagement involved grabbing Near Easterners roughly by their hair. It's probably safe to assume that there were also other, more mutually beneficial exchanges going on. Also, if you're like me, when you hear of ancient armies marching into battle, you typically imagine them using swords and armor. But as we discussed earlier, the Sumerians only started using tin bronze, giving them at least the ability to make metal armor and weapons, a few hundred years after this time period. And they were the first civilization to do so. That means that the weapons used in this early stage of Egyptian warfare were still literally Stone Age weapons. There was the mace, its shape refined over thousands of years to inflict maximum damage, but still essentially a stone head with a wooden handle. There was also the bow, in use in Egypt since at least 5000 BC, in what's called the pre-dynastic period, and the spear, used with a copper spearhead. Simple clubs and slings would have rounded out the period's arsenal. Though they didn't use armor, Egyptian soldiers did use large wooden shields covered in leather hides. We're talking about very, very ancient warfare here. The widespread use of metal armor and weapons was still some time off. Returning to the Narmer palette, on the opposite side, Narmer is shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, implying that he's now king of both lands. The rows of decapitated captives reinforce the image of king as conqueror, as does the image of Narmer as a rampaging bull breaching the walls of a fortified town and crushing an enemy beneath his hooves. The scenes on another find, the Narmer Macehead, show the king participating in a Heb-Sed festival to renew his own potency, and through that, the fertility of the land. Narmer. He'll trample your enemies and keep your land fertile. I'm guessing every ancient Egyptian could get behind that campaign slogan. Narmer likely ruled from Nekhen in Upper Egypt, a city with a population between 5,000 and 10,000 that was already several centuries old by the time he came to power. The city not only boasted Egypt's oldest known temple complex, dedicated to the Egyptian hawk god Horus, but also a brewery capable of producing 300 gallons of beer per day. Aside from drinking beer and worshipping Horus, other staples of later Egyptian civilization, including mummification, painted tombs, and hieroglyphic writing, were also being practiced at Nekhen. Even during this early period, Egypt's next ruler, Hor-Aha, consolidated his predecessor's military gains and also founded a new capital at Memphis, just south of the apex of the Nile Delta. After ruling for over 60 years, again, according to Manetho, he earned the distinction of being the first Egyptian ruler to meet his end, by being carried off by a hippopotamus during a hunt. Only slightly weirder is the fact that he wouldn't be the last. Anyway, all things being equal, I'm guessing he'd prefer being remembered more for the founding Memphis thing. As in Mesopotamia, grain surpluses encouraged trade specialization, which in turn led to the construction of monumental architecture. However, unlike in Mesopotamia, Egyptian monuments were focused mainly on the afterlife. After Memphis was founded, the early Egyptian kings, they weren't known as pharaohs until much later, began to construct their tombs at the sacred site of Abydos in Middle Egypt. The nobles, in turn, constructed theirs. On the edge of the Saqqara Desert Plateau, overlooking Memphis, lie remnants of a bygone era. A significant portion of the archaeological evidence for these ancient rulers comes from ivory and wood labels discovered at these sites. The names of these rulers were inscribed in a serek, which resembled the facade of a palace and served as a precursor to the more familiar cartouche. Egypt, alongside Sumer, holds the distinction of being one of the few places in the ancient world where writing emerged independently. Ivory labels belonging to the Egyptian king Den, unearthed at Abydos, showcase early forms of Egyptian hieroglyphics, revealing their nascent stage of development. One particular label features 4 lines of characters depicting 2 ships, the symbol for a town, and King Den's name enclosed in a serek. It appears to document a visit to the northern delta region. Another label details a religious event, possibly involving the sacrifice of retainers, a practice intended to supply rulers with a workforce in the afterlife. This custom was eventually replaced by the burial of small, mummy-like figures known as ushabtis, a change that undoubtedly was welcomed by the retainers. King Der, the successor to Hor-Aha, reigned over Egypt around 3000 BC. Following Der's rule came the reigns of Diet and Den, succeeded by Anejib, Semerket, and Kwa. The historical record varies in its depth for these rulers, providing ample information on some like Den, while offering less insight into others. The accounts speak of several wars, internal conflicts between the north and south regions, and possible usurpations inferred from the removal of previous rulers from the king lists. The subsequent Second Dynasty comprised 6 rulers, about whom the historical records provide minimal details beyond their names. During this period, the internal strife between Upper and Lower Egypt intensified, taking on a religious dimension as partisans of Upper Egypt aligned themselves with the god Seth, while those in the Nile Delta favored Horus. One ruler, Seth-Peribsen, even abandoned his Horus name and adopted the name Seth-Peribsen, suggesting the ascendancy of Seth's followers during his reign. The final ruler of the dynasty, Khase-Khemui, incorporated the names of both gods within his serek, indicating his desire to serve as a religious diplomat and peacemaker between the 2 factions. The 5 centuries between 3200 BC and 2700 BC laid the groundwork for Egyptian civilization. During this time, the internal strife between Upper and Lower Egypt intensified, with partisans of the god Seth clashing with those who favored Horus. Ultimately, the last ruler of the dynasty, Khase-Khemui, worked to bring peace between the factions, and his reign marked the culmination of a period of great change. But the coming era of rulers would be one of the most pivotal in the history of the entire ancient world. They built upon the advances of previous centuries in technology, hieroglyphic writing, and artistic representation, and established what is known as the Egyptian Old Kingdom. You might recognize them better for the enormous, awe-inspiring, architecturally stunning pyramid-shaped burial monuments they constructed, which, by the way, you can still visit today. You guessed it. We're talking about the pyramid builders. But that's a story for our next episode. If you're fascinated by the story of the Egyptians, you won't want to miss the monumental journey we're about to take. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when the new episode drops. Next time, we'll shift our focus north from Egypt to explore one of the most vibrant civilizations of the ancient world, the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete. From there, we'll travel to ancient Britain to explore the Neolithic monument builders. And finally, we'll examine the only other large-scale urban complex in the entire ancient world in 3000 BC, aside from Sumer, located along the coast of Peru. Join me in uncovering the impossible. I'll see you next time on The Ancient World.